All right, we will get started. Good to see everybody. Tonight we are going to be continuing our study of the years of silence. We will be studying Greece. So this has been a lot of fun to study, and I'm looking forward to. I'm excited about the class tonight. Before we jump in and get started, I've asked Emery if he would please lead us in a word of prayer.
Father in heaven, we are blessed that we could be here, and it's by your doing that we are allowed to be here, by the privilege of letting us come together to worship you, Father. May we listen attentively, may we apply the things we learn, and may we praise your name. These things we pray in your Son's dear and precious name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Maybe I'll get the hang of all this one day, all these things I got to keep up with. You'd think I'd remember to put my microphone on by now. So, as we enter into our study of Greece in the years of silence, I want us to remember that the main point is not just, hey, these are interesting historical facts, and these are things I studied back in high school that it's a good reminder of, and kind of enlightens our understanding maybe about some biblical things in the New Testament. It's not just that. Those things are helpful, but what's our ultimate reason that we're wanting to study the years of silence?
Understand the New Testament.
Yes, that's a big part of it. What was the thing that I drove home on Sunday? Remember? It's all pointing to Jesus, right? History is his story. And so all these things are pointing to Jesus. I want us to just keep that in mind as we continue on this study. And so let's start out with just a quick review of what we talked about on Sunday. We went all the way back to the beginning of the Persian kingdom and saw that when Persia was first established and the Jews returned, the first return from captivity and everything, we added then the Greek thread and saw that right out of the gate, the Greeks start to kind of be a thorn in the side of the Persians, these Greek states. It's not really yet a formed, united kingdom. And then we have Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, and that's when the years of silence begin. How long does Persia, stay in power as the world power after the last book of the Old Testament is finished? About 100 years, okay? So the first 100 of the 400 years of silence, Persia is still in power. And we just saw just kind of how sad things got in Persia with this, quick turnover of all these kings. And in Greece, or with the Grecian people, there was an increase of power and unity. And with the Jews, there was an increase of prosperity. And then, of course, Philip of Macedon is killed, and his son, at 20 years of age, takes over as king of the Greeks, king of Macedon. And so what we're going to do for tonight is we're going to expand that center column and just focus on it. The other columns are going to fade into the background. We're not going to bring the Persian column back up because Persia is going to be defeated. And we're going to focus on Alexander the Great. We're going to focus on the aftermath once he dies. And, of course, bring this all back around to the main point that history is Jesus' story. See how all this points to him. So we have to talk about Alexander the Great. We just have to focus on him for a little bit. He's obviously one of the most important characters in all of history, but in terms of biblical history, he's very important, partly because the Bible prophesied about Alexander. Remember in Daniel chapter 8, we studied about that. And also, his just influence on the world is just huge. And so we go all the way back to his childhood. He's born in 356 BC in Pella, Greece. And he is tutelaged under Aristotle. All right? And Terry and I were just talking. We got our Greek philosophers mixed up on Sunday. He had mentioned it was Socrates, and I just was like, yeah, okay. And that wasn't on my mind because I was studying the other material. So it's Aristotle. And so So this young man, so he's about 13 when he starts being trained under Aristotle. He's brilliant. And he is trained in every Greek way, both physically and mentally and spiritually. And he's just, by all accounts, he's just a genius. And he has so much potential. And he's going to use that potential to his full advantage. He's got a really strong personality and a very impetuous nature. And we'll kind of see some of that a little bit later. So we mentioned Philip was assassinated. That was year 336. And when that happened, all of a sudden now Alexander has this kingdom. Everything had already kind of been prepped for Alexander's success because Philip had been successful, right? But he hadn't been as ambitious and he hadn't been as confrontational to his enemies. He was more diplomatic, not Alexander. And so now Alexander has the reins. And right out of the gate, there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of revolting from some of the Greek city-states. And so Alexander has to flex his muscles, and he has to really show a strong, have a strong show of force. And so what he does right out of the gate is goes on what is called the Balkan campaign, the southeastern portion of Europe, in order to secure the northern portion of his kingdom, right? The northern border of his kingdom. And so he went into Thrace and defeated many cities. And then one of his own cities in what is called the Hellenic League, or the League of Corinth, rebelled. And does anybody remember what city that was that revolted against him? Thebes. Yeah, Thebes. And so he goes down and just crushes Thebes. I mean, it was kind of surprising to people what he did to this city, and he just leveled it, just burned it to the ground, and was pretty merciless with that defeat. And but that sent a real message that, hey, Alexander means business, and we need to just submit to him. So now he more or less has control of his own territory, and everything's secure there. And now he can go travel eastward to conquer Persia like his father had wanted to do but never did, right? So that's what he is going to do. Starting in year 334, he travels into Asia and crosses the Hellespont and comes to this river called the Granicus River, or Granicus River, and faces his first opposition just as soon as he enters into Asia. And there is a Persian force on the other side of this river, and they're taunting Alexander, having the impetuous nature that he does, and no fear of battle, because that's all he'd ever done. I mean, he just, he's on his horse. What's his horse's name? Bucephalus? Is that how you say it? Is that how you say it? And then he just starts going right out, wading through the river, straight toward the Persian army. And they're like, what is going on? And then his army just started coming after, like behind him, and it was just an easy defeat. And I mean, the thing was, in all of these battles, these other militaries that he was up against, they had no chance. They stood no chance against Alexander's army. Because for one thing, Alexander's army had been fighting together for like a generation. They were really, really good, and they had some amazing strategies. They would use this, what's called the phalanx, and it was like this rectangular formation of soldiers. It was 8 soldiers deep, and the ones in the back had these big, long spears that went out in front of the people in the front. And they would use that along with some cavalrymen to the side, who their job was to like punch a hole through the front lines of the enemy, And so they would like create this opening, and then these cavalrymen would go through the opening and come and attack from behind, followed by the cavalrymen followed by the other guys who punched a hole through the front line. They would go in, they would attack from behind as well, and then you had the phalanx that would continue doing their battle and just crush them from both sides. Very effective. They used that method over and over. He would evolve his military strategies when he would fight against other effective militaries, and he would take on some of their practices. But I love the illustration that Bob Waldron gave. If you were an army that went up against Alexander at that time, it would be kind of like if there was like a varsity football team that had played together for like 3 years, and they went up against a football team of volunteers from the stadium. That's kind of what it was, because these other armies was just a bunch of volunteers from the masses of the peoples of the nation they were up against. They weren't professionally trained and everything, but that's not the case with the Grecian military. It was really the first military like that. It was a true professional military, professionally trained and very strategic. And so, I mean, they would almost always be outnumbered, sometimes 4 or 5 to 1, and they just mopped the floor with their enemies. It was crazy. So they continued traveling eastward, through Asia Minor. Just mostly these cities were willing to submit. Sometimes certain cities were not willing to submit. They came to Issus, that is there at the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea, just on the northern border of modern-day Syria. And they had a battle there, another battle with the Persians. The Persians came out against them. This time Darius III, the king of Persia, is with the army. I assume he wasn't before in the other battle, but he is with this one. And this was a particularly interesting battle because they had mountains on one side and they had the Mediterranean on the other, and they had a small portion of the beach to fight on. So although the Persian army was just huge, they couldn't have a whole lot of their soldiers out there at once to fight. And because of the strategy of the Greeks and that whole thing that I just explained a minute ago, they were able to be very effective against the Persians. And the Persians saw that they were on the losing side. And so does anybody remember what happened? You can see it. You can see it right here. That's Darius III. What did he do? He put his tail between his legs and he fled like a scared little puppy. And this is going to kind of be his go-to maneuver. It's fight or flight. And for him, it's a lot of flight. And so he flees, and the rest of the military, they all start fleeing too. But the problem is there was just a narrow pass in the mountains, and this large army, it was just kind of this bottleneck. They couldn't get through there all at once, and all those who were out there exposed, they were just sitting ducks for the trained military of Alexander. I mean, just slaughter them. Huge plunder, huge success. But the king had escaped. So Alexander is not ruler yet of Persia, but they're gonna hunt him down later. But for now, they want to take advantage of the opportunity to go down through Judea and on down to Egypt. So they do. They go down to Tyre. This is probably my favorite part of this whole class. I just love this particular battle, or siege, and then a short battle. So Tyre was a city at this time that was just an island city. There used to be a mainland city and an island city, but the mainland city had been destroyed back in the time of Babylon. You guys remember we studied about that when we were studying Isaiah, and I think we looked in Ezekiel some at that. But this island city was formidable. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar had tried to defeat the island city. He had tried to besiege it for like 12 or 15 years. The numbers kind of vary depending on the source you look at, and couldn't defeat it. So Alexander decides to try something new and different. Now, I should have mentioned Tyre was the headquarters of the Persian Navy. All right, and so that's why it wasn't optional. He had to take Tyre. He had to do whatever he had to do to take it. But he couldn't compete with their navy because he had no navy. So you all know what he did. It's pretty famous. He had his engineers take the rubble from the old site of Babylon, which you're looking at a picture here of what is still left of that, and took the rubble from that old city, built a causeway out. It's about a half mile out to the island city, and just took 7 months to build this causeway that was 2 football fields wide. 7 months. Went out there and took them. And when he took them, he really slaughtered them, except for the women and children. Sold them as slaves. That was his his typical methodology. And so, this picture that you're looking at is looking toward the island city. There is no inland city. The Bible prophesied, I believe it's in Isaiah 23, that it would never be rebuilt. It has never been rebuilt. And I believe it will never be rebuilt, just like the ancient site of Babylon, that, by the way, Alexander wanted to rebuild, and he died in Babylon. We'll talk about that. So you're looking at the causeway. This is a Roman arch, but the causeway of Alexander is right through there. That is really cool. All right, so as we continue, he continues traveling south down along the Mediterranean coast. He comes to Gaza. He had to take Gaza because there was a Persian garrison at Gaza. And so I won't explain what all happened, but they had to be creative again. If they could make a causeway out half a mile through the ocean, then they could find a way to get to this formidable city and its huge wall. They just built an earthen ramp. And they dug a tunnel under the wall, too. So anyway, they were able to take Gaza. Went to Egypt. Now, what was the situation with Egypt? Did they run into any trouble in Egypt?
No, Egypt just said, we're fine.
They were glad for Alexander to come. He was like a deliverer in their eyes, and they welcomed him. And so, well, that was easy. He's ruler of Egypt now. He planned to have a city named after him built there, Alexandria, and many other Alexandrias would later also be built, but that one would be the primary one. And that's going to come up later in our story tonight. So you can see that right there, where that city would later be. All right, now it's time to go and catch back up with that, scaredy cat king of Persia named Darius III. So they travel back up north, and they find Darius at a city that is called Guagamela. I always want to say Guatemala. Guagamela. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. But again, same thing that happened at Issus. The Greeks are winning. Persians see that they're losing. Darius III, he flees. And he even abandons his whole family. And he had already done that back at Issus. But he flees. And so it's kind of frustrating. Though it was a victory for Alexander, he's still not, he still doesn't rule all of Persia. So there's this chase that then happens. It's this impressive chase. The military of Alexander could march at an unprecedented pace, and it was very amazing. They at Susa. I should mention this real quick. Do y'all remember what happened at Susa from the book? What he took at Susa?
King's treasure.
It was a treasure. Yeah, and it was just like, y'all. It was so much gold. It would be in the billions. Okay, it is hard to fathom how much gold that they found there. So, the army's doing all right. Well, they continue traveling eastward through what is modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan. So Darius has fled. So they pursue him up this way and all the way into what was at that time called Parthia. And I'm not sure exactly where they caught up with him, but by the time they caught up with him, what was the deal? What was the situation with Darius? He was dead already. He'd been murdered by his own people. One of his own people had arranged for that or done that himself and appointed himself kind of the next king and all that. So, Darius III is now dead. So that makes Alexander the ruler of Persia. So we no longer have Persia as the world power anymore. He did what his father never did and never accomplished, but dreamed of accomplishing and wanted to accomplish. But now Alexander, he just went out and did it. It's pretty amazing. Well, they continued conquering, and I think they were also kind of trying to chase down the one who is claiming to now have the throne in Persia. And they went on conquest east and north, and they went as far east as India. And they even began conquering India. It's pretty crazy. I mean, they could have kept conquering India, but what happened? Yeah, the soldiers, they said, we're done. Like, we do have a life back home, and we've been fighting, and we're done. And he said, no, you're not. And they said, yes, we are. And that's exactly how the conversation went, in Greek. But that's kind of how it was. I mean, it was just a violent opposition. They got as far as this river that is the it's right here, the Hephaestus River. Yeah, if that's how you say it. And they're like, that's it. We're not going any further. And then his general had to convince him, listen to them, let them go back. So, all right. So they start heading back west. And it's pretty treacherous. I mean, we see these arrows and we're like, oh, yeah, that's where they went. Well, it really took a long time. It took many months. And they're going through the desert. As they travel back, they're going a different route here, not too far from the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. And many soldiers die out there in the desert. Does Alexander ever make it back home? What happens? He dies in Babylon. I was mentioning this earlier. In Babylon, now, he had planned to make Babylon his capital. He was going to rebuild it. And do you remember in Isaiah 13 that it says that in Isaiah 13, it says that the city would never be rebuilt, and yet that was his goal. I'm going to do it. I'm going to rebuild it. And so, no, you're not. He dies in Babylon, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. Apparently from a fever. There's a lot of debate. There was a lot of drinking that was done by Alexander. There was a lot of drinking that was going on at this time. Best buddy of his had died, and that might be part of it. But long story short, it looks like mostly it was a fever that he didn't have the health to recover from. And so he's dead, 32 years old. The ruler of the world dies of a fever, apparently. And I just thought this might be a good moment for us to just pause. And I just want to ask y'all, what can we learn from that? I mean, here's a man that had everything. He had more gold than you can fathom. He had anything he wanted. He had a harem of wives. He was the ruler of the world. He had all the promise of being able to continue conquering and spreading his kingdom as far as he could possibly dream. And he dies of a fever. What can we learn from that spiritually for us?
I think of the parable of the rich landowner.
You remind me.
He says, what am I going to do with all these crops, And he builds a bigger barn. Right. He says, now I can eat, drink, and be merry. Yeah. And then God tells him that night, he says, you fool, do you not know that your soul is required of you tonight?
That's right. Yeah, and putting our priorities in the wrong place.
Right.
And putting our trust in all these riches and all these earthly accomplishments and earthly success. Yeah. Good. Anything else you can learn from that?
His eyes were bigger than his stomach.
Okay.
He bit off more than he could chew.
Yeah, he did.
Because how would he rule all of that?
And even already at this point, Macedonia has been kind of holding down the fort, but it's been suffering because he's been gone from really his homeland, and because of the fact that he's been gone and continuing all these battles, the weakening of the western portion of the kingdom has been continuing, and that's going to have an effect later down the road when Rome comes in from the west. So there's that effect too. Try not to pop my knuckles. That was very loud. Yes, Miss Joy, anything else?
God's in control.
God's in control. God's in control, absolutely. What else can we learn? Jesus said, he who lives by the sword, die by the sword. And he kind of got what, He didn't actually get killed by the sword, as it were.
Yeah, but his rich life.
That principle applies to,
sword down.
that's right, it applies to what was surrounding his whole world and that way of living. Okay, good. All right, well, let's move on now and look at the aftermath. After he died, his kingdom was really divided up and given the control of basically 4 generals. There were actually 6, but there were 4 who controlled the main portion of what was left over. And what were these 4 areas that were ruled over?
One of them was called Syria.
All right, one of them was called Syria. There's Egypt.
Wouldn't it have been part of Turkey?
There was Asia Minor.
Asia.
Yeah, and there was Macedonia. All right. So, there was kind of this idea that we're all going to work together. We're looking out for the kingdom. Yeah. After Alexander's brother, Philip, was assassinated, and his own son, who was named Alexander, was born after he died. After he was assassinated, after the 2 potential heirs to the throne, the 2 that came from Philip, that descended from Philip, that could be on the throne, after they were murdered, then it was just a dogfight after that. This battle for dominance, these 4 generals. And this continued till 301. And that's when this Peace of Ipsus was written and signed. It was a treaty peace for these generals that would kind of solidify where each one would reign, so they'd stop fighting over that. And there were 4 kingdoms that were really solidified from that point forward, and only 2 of them really are, helpful for our purposes to know about, and those are which 2? Anybody? I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Somebody say Syria? All right. All right. So Syria. And what else was Syria called? All right. Seleucia. And then Egypt was called Ptolemy or the Ptolemies. So those are the 2 that we really have to be concerned with. Look how big Syria is. This is huge. And then here's Egypt down here. All right. Now, you guys remember several weeks ago when we studied the vision that Daniel had. He sees this ram with these 2 horns, one bigger than the other. That represents what kingdom? Medo-Persia. And then he sees this goat just flying, literally. He's not even touching the ground, flying from the west. And he's got this one horn. And of course, the goat, tramples down, kills the ram. And in Daniel 8:8, it says, "Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." So you guys remember, this is just a reminder. And we studied about that. So here's this goat with these 4 horns, 4 different directions. And then the angel explains in 21 and 22, the angel Gabriel, "The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in his place represent 4 kingdoms, which will arise from his nation, although not with his power." We just studied the fulfillment of that with Alexander the Great. He was a horn that broke off, this arrogant king, and then after that, the kingdom is split into four parts. So that's powerful. I mean, it was written 300 years before the fulfillment. Really powerful, really faith-building. All right, we're going to open up now for a little bit of discussion. What is the significance of the fact that now Greece is a world power? I mean, we've had other world powers. You've had Egypt, you've had Assyria, you've had Babylon, you've had other world powers, but there's something different about this world power and something very significant about it as it relates to the Bible narrative. So what things come to your mind?
Universal language.
Universal language. And as Greek. Now, what's so significant? What's different about Greek? You know, people don't know about something, they say it's all Greek to me. Why do you think they say that? Miss Mary?
Well, I don't know the answer.
No? Well, that's okay. I asked a weird question.
But,
What were you going to say?
But Greek was a versatile language, sort of like
Yeah.
English. It had a lot more capacity than many other
Yes. And it's a difficult language. It is a difficult language to kind of master, and that's because it is so nuanced. There are all these case endings, and I mean, I studied Greek for like 3 years at college, and I forgot like almost everything that I studied, and it's mind-numbing. It is mind-numbing, y'all. I would spend like over 4 hours on my tests in Greek, and I was just it was torture. It was like torture. It was awful. But, and I forgot most of it, but I do know that you can be extremely nuanced in Greek in ways that you cannot do with English. You probably cannot do with most languages. And what's so helpful about that, this would be the language whenever Jesus came. This was the universal language. For the gospel to be spread to the whole world is a language that could be very understood in very nuanced ways. And this would be the language that the New Testament would be written in and that would then be translated to all the languages in the world. From this, I mean, if the New Testament had been revealed in English, it would have been really tough to translate that into all other languages. But since it's written in Greek, we can understand very fine nuances. And so it's just really incredible. Good. What else? What's significant? What else is significant? Significant. Still learning how to talk. About Greece being the world power.
They believed in libraries, for one thing. They believed in intellectual finding out about the world.
Okay.
And they were the ones that had the Bible translated into Greek.
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So the Greek way of thinking was very much, your mind is very powerful. You think for yourself, and there's all this rational thought that really is what will empower you, right? Rational, independent thought. Is that very much how our culture is? Yeah, and that's still, I think, an influence that goes back to the Grecian Empire.
Is that considered an enlightened age of knowledge and, as we say, new thoughts, type of growth?
I think so, and that has its downsides as well, but it was just different. It was just new and different. Good. Jack?
Adam, the New Testament is written primarily in Koine Greek, some Aramaic. There is classical Greek in the first 4 verses of Luke, which, he was just showing off, I think. I am a smart man. But there's not, classical Greek does not intrude into the New Testament anywhere. And the Koine Greek, which was what it was written in, what became a dead language. So it doesn't change. The meaning doesn't change.
Right. That's right.
There is a classical problem that an American had when he went to Canada and held a meeting, a preacher, and he said about their child, he's a cute little bugger. Well, the word bugger meant homosexual in Canada. And so, I've heard that expression used about children many times,
So to understand which Greek we're talking about is helpful. Yeah, you're right. It's koine. Koine means common. So it's common Greek, which was not as refined of Greek as classical Greek was. Great. Now, let me just put up on the screen some other things real quick. The Jews were influenced by the Grecian worldview, obviously, for the next 300 years. So that's one thing that makes it very, very significant. Changes in names and places of things in the Old Testament, of people and places. So, like, it's called Judah in the Old Testament. In Greek, it's Judea. It's actually like Judaea. It's Judaeah. But usually it's just Judea. in our Bibles, but that's because of the change in languages. So all that's interesting. All right, ready to keep moving? Y'all have anything else you want to add or ask? Brian?
Philosophical discourse. I mean, look at Paul going to Athens in
Yeah.
Acts 17, and he can stand before the Areopagus, and they're like, "Hey, what new thing do you bring?" You know, because they sat around wanting to hear new things, and so that was an open thing for the gospel.
Sure, it would be helpful in some ways. Now, in some ways, this idea of placing all this importance on your teacher in philosophy, did that impede the gospel sometimes? I mean, Paul had to deal with that early in the book of 1 Corinthians, did he not? And they were choosing different, preachers, apostles, as this is my leader. I am of Paul. I am of Apollos. I am of Cephas. Well, I'm of Christ. Well, we should all be of Christ. Where did that thinking come from? It came from the Greeks. Because they would choose, well, this one over here, that's my philosopher. Well, I'm of the philosophy of this guy over here, right? And everybody had their school of thought, and that really messed people up with the gospel. And I mean, even today, people have a tendency to just kind of cling to a man and follow his ideology. We need to follow this, right? Follow what Jesus taught, so obviously. Okay, good thoughts. Let's move forward. Now we're coming back to our timeline, but now we have 3 columns. We're back to a 3-column structure, but there's no more Persia. Thank you. No more Persia, but we now have 2 different Greek columns and 1 Jewish column. So we're focusing on Syria, or the Seleucids, and Egypt, or the Ptolemies. Okay. And every time I say Ptolemy, I'm going to say it different, okay? Just so you know, because I'm still trying to figure out, is it Ptolemy, is it Ptolemy? And I always say it different, but that's okay. So we start out here. First of all, right out of the gate, after the peace of Ipsus, the Egyptian Empire has control over Judea, even though the peace of Ipsus said it actually belonged to Syria. But see, if you go back a few years, Seleucus Nicator used to be under Ptolemy Soter. Used to be under him. And so now they're ruling these 2 big kingdoms. And so when Ptolemy Soter says, "I want Judea," Seleucus Nicator says, "Okay, you can have it." I mean, it's not like he didn't have a huge area himself anyway. It wasn't like a big loss for him. And so they just kind of had this understanding. It's almost like, hey, we're friends here. This is all part of the same big empire. And so that continues till they die. By the way, just this map real quick, you can see where Egypt has control over Judea. And that would really be the case for the next more than 100 years, for the most part, is the Ptolemaic kingdom is going to have control over Judea. Okay? Now, come back here. So the Jews, they're allowed to worship however they want to worship. So they can keep worshiping the right way and not worship idols and all of that and not face any punishment. All right, skip that. So you have the death of these 2 kings, king of Syria, king of Egypt. After that, there's no more playing nice. It's not like we're going to try to get along anymore. It's a battle for the next century over who controls Judea, and mostly Egypt comes out on top. You have many Jews travel to Egypt at this time, migrate there. In fact, Alexandria becomes a center for Judaism, like a very important center for Judaism. You have the Septuagint is written in 280, and the Septuagint. Does anybody know what the Septuagint was?
70 scholars or 70 days.
All right, so it was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That's right. Jay, were you saying something? Oh, I'm sorry, just answering. Okay. Bible class is almost over, right? Okay, just making sure my timing's right. Yeah, so that was a huge development. Last thing I want to mention real quick, we'll be done. Y'all have held on well. No, it's like a big history lesson. But Antiochus III in 198 takes control of Judea, takes that control away from Greece. The Jews think this is fine. He's nice to us. Well, that's all going to change before long. Brian will talk about some of that as we enter Rome into our threads, and he'll talk about Rome on Sunday. Thanks for holding on, everybody. You did good.